You heard the
I
question.
am a seventh generation rabbi. That's correct.
Okay. Okay. So then my second part of the question is, so was the decision to become a spiritual leader kind of an obvious or intrinsic one because of that lineage, or?
Yeah, so I'm the oldest of my five younger brothers. So I'm the oldest of six sons, and it was kind of sort of I grew up in the business, and it was something that was a natural thing to do to become a rabbi. Though I never intended to make my living as a rabbi. I actually was planning on going to law school. I graduated rabbinical school when I was 23, so I was pretty young, I already had a BA and then had rabbinical ordination, was planning to go to law school, and then decided to take a year before I went to law school. I'd gotten into law school, took a year off because I didn't want to live like a student. I was getting married. I wanted to make a little money. So I got a job, and I actually enjoyed serving as a rabbi. I was a rabbi in a congregation. I had a lot of opportunity in that congregation. It was a very well-resourced and large congregation, and I had tremendous opportunity. And I stayed. It was in St. Louis, Missouri. I stayed there for about 4.5 years, and then I wound up having this opportunity to move to this think tank called the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and got to study with sort of one of the preeminent end of the 20th century Jewish thinkers, a man by the name of Yitz Greenberg, a doctor and rabbi. And I've wound up there for the last 30 years. Sort of, it's a think tank that has pivoted. It started really working inside the organized Jewish community, helping them reimagine for a post-establishment of the State of Israel, post-Holocaust world. And it pivoted to, over the last 15 years as I've been president, it's pivoted to a place that is rethinking and reimagining religion in general. And we work at the intersection of religion, innovation, and the public good, or the sciences of human flourishing. And sort of if you can imagine, I think about religion as sort of post-religion, post-Jewish, post-Christian. When you look at the sort of trajectory and of religious affiliation and institutional affiliation, I mean, in Europe, you really have a profound secularization in Europe. And here in the United States, the fastest growing demographic is the disaffiliated or the deinstitutionalized. And that's taking innovation studies very seriously. Non-consumers of the existing products and services is a very interesting market for what we do and for how I think about the jobs to get done of religion.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, my aunt likes to tell me, oh, we're losing Jews, and it's really upsetting to her. And I think that reimagining religion is the way to kind of reach young people and reach people who are so focused on technology.
So I don't all in a moment of disruption or technological advance, there's always a sort of gap between the technology that's advancing and the power that technology is giving us and the access that technology is giving us, whatever that is, whether it's a printing press circumnavigating the globe, writing, or these days the variety of different technologies that are coming together in the fourth industrial age. But there's always a gap between technological advance and sort of the psycho-spiritual, psycho-ethical advances. And so that just means that we sort of evolve more slowly regarding consciousness than we do being able to manipulate matter. And so we shouldn't be surprised that religions, which are all the major religions, are essentially axial age, which is somewhere between 7,000 BC and the whatever. I mean, Islam is a little later, but over 700 years. We shouldn't be surprised that they're showing weakening, and it's not about Judaism eroding or Christianity eroding. I mean, 10,000 churches a year are going under in the United States over the last decade. A third of the entire sector is probably going to go under in terms of institutional religion. But the issue isn't so much protecting and preserving the religion. The issue is the jobs that religion historically got done that are central to sort of what it means to be a human being and an ethical, moral, conscious human being, one that loves, one that cares, one that has compassion, whose virtues are developing. Those jobs still need to get done. And the question is, how are they going to get done? How are the existing religions going to reimagine themselves? And as interesting, in what other sectors will some of those jobs begin to be taken on?
Right. Oh, that definitely makes sense. So I was looking at your book, Yearnings, and unfortunately I didn't have a chance to read it all, but I sort of read about it, and hopefully I have a sort of a grasp of what it's about. So in my understanding, you talk about how our longings are the gateway to self-discovery, and embracing taboo can help us live more fully. So, how could tapping into these parts of ourselves lead us to what we might call utopia?
So, as human beings, desire is the animating energy, right? From the reflexive desires to right that are to breathe literally, and then the full range of desires. But I guess most important, the desire to exercise our power and control our circumstances and improve our health and improve the world, and of course, and what we call sort of the utopian fantasy, the utopian dream, to perfect everything, right? And to have more knowledge, to have more power, to have more abundance, to have more health, to have more wealth, to have more love, to have more control over our circumstances. I mean, those desires are the animating energy. They are what make us profoundly human, and our ability to realize a lot of those desires. Utopia just becomes all the desires played out to the nth degree, which the utopian fantasy is a very real part of the human being. It's a promised land fantasy, but it's always important to remember that the promised land is always promised. It's not gotten. It's not the gotten land. And so utopia is an aspiration, and you show me a person that doesn't have any utopian aspirations or any sort of crazy wild fantasies, and I'll show you a person who's not flourishing and living to the fullest of their potential. Of course, the challenge is to understand that our dreams of utopia themselves are constantly changing. What it means to be in utopia in the 10th century is going to be different, because our understanding of what perfection is different. Our understanding of what returning to the Garden of Eden is different, right? Our returning of our understanding of human rights is different. So we're always expanding the very definition of the perfection that we're yearning for, which means that the desires themselves change. And my book is fundamentally about that our desires, if we can become more aware of them and more conscious of them, are incredible sources of wisdom, because they indicate what it is we lack, and then examining that lack, we can determine whether it's a lack that is worth moving on and fulfilling, or a lack that comes from a space that is sort of psychologically distorted or unrich. And right now, this has never been more important, because essentially in the West, and the internet and social media platforms have aggravated this, but essentially in the West, we now have an economic and social model completely dependent on getting whatever we want, how we want it, whenever we want it, as most efficiently and effectively as possible. And an entire kind of social system completely based on desire, or desire as a basis for politics, for economy, for society, is problematic. What makes us most deeply human is our ability to examine our desires, to see, to explore our desires, to note where those desires are come, to be able to parse and discern where those desires actually lead to suffering, where those desires are misplaced. If we desire the infinite and we look for the infinite only in the finite, then we wind up messing up a lot. And so I think that a moment in which this is messy, and that's why the rest of the book is called, the title is Embracing the Sacred Messiness of Life, because it's messy to be conscious of our desires. But of course, that is what distinguishes us fundamentally from animals. And
Right.
and you can see what's happening as we are able to fulfill more of our desires, especially in the material world. So, for example, our ability to feed ourselves in ways that we never could in history has produced less hunger than ever before, but obesity. So, because we're hardwired, for scarcity, and so desires in a context of scarcity need to be handled and managed and understood differently than desires in a context of abundance.
Right.
So the same desire, the desire to feed oneself, the desire for calories, the desire to savor something, desire for enjoyment of that food and that succulent taste and that sweet taste, that same and for that fatty fullness, that same desire in the 10th century, yet alone 50,000 years ago, is absolutely essential and ensures that we actually hoard and save and preserve for the next day when we're going to be hungry. But that same desire, because the desire stays the same, that same desire to be fed, to be satisfied, to be full, when we're able to produce the kind of food as abundant as we can with all the calories and more than we ever could, right? If we don't understand that desire more deeply and explore it, we wind up hoarding and, becoming obese.
Right.
But that's the same
Yeah, and
with
you can apply that to anything.
it's the same with
Really.
anything, because all human beings have a desire. We have a desire to know others, to know about our circumstance, and to be known by other people, to be known, and to be loved. So for most of human history, opacity and not knowing was the fundamental sort of human condition. And so the desire to know in that context is really different than the desire to know, where there's such an overflow of information about anybody, in which something that I did 20 years ago can be known and destroy my reputation. And so literally the desire to be known has to be sort of re-explored. The desire for truth. The desire for truth is fundamental to what it means to be human. It's not like an animal wakes up in the morning and says, I want to seek the truth about life. But the desire to seek the truth in a moment, in an era, in a pre-scientific age in which, we didn't know that much about life, is really different than when we have access to every piece of fake and real information. When we have access like that, but we don't have the ability to discriminate between the fake and the real, it's a much more complicated condition. And so examining our desires becomes really, really serious. When we have perfect memory, right? But we all want to remember. Who wants to forget? In scripture it says, remember, remember, don't forget, remember, remember, remember me. We say to the God character, we want to be remembered by each other. We want to remember our ancestors. Our ancestors want to be remembered. Well, what happens? That desire is a remarkable desire and fuels growth and fuels development. On the other hand, when we actually get perfect memory, but without the sort of necessary corresponding compassion for each other's past missteps and failures, what happens? And so there's a sort of we all desire intimacy, right? And these are chapters in the book. We all desire intimacy. But what happens when we get the intimacy of a sort of universal connectivity without the social skills to navigate it? Then we have to really examine that desire for intimacy. In some respects, we've bitten from the apple. You know, we've walked out of the Garden of Eden. We've bitten from the apple, which is what a technologically fundamental change is. And that's why I think these religious metaphors are incredibly important. From a literal perspective, religions are actually anywhere from fetish to trivial to stupid to dangerous. But in terms of metaphors, as expressions of a sort of a deep understanding of the human condition, they're very important. So humanity has stepped out of the garden. It's bitten from the apple. It's not an accident that Apple is called Apple, you know, the company. And when you walk out, it's like, you know, when you've bitten from the apple, it says her eyes were opened, right? And by the way, she started by desiring the apple. There was a desire. You eat the apple, but then, wow, like new world, man, and got to figure it out.
Yeah. Wow, that's an interesting point.
And if you don't do that, you wind up with sort of, again, I'm not as aware of Europe. I think Europe is probably, my sense from, you know, just reading is Europe is handling some of this a little bit better than we are. But in the United States, what we have right now is this technological advance, and let's leave the medical part out right now, where biotech is and infotech and the Internet of Things and wearables, all that's coming together. Let's hold that. What's really going on in the United States is we have a sort of unleashed consumerism coupled with a sort of surveillance state and economy. And you know, that's not good long term. And we're seeing the sort of populist reactions here, and I think you're seeing some of those in Europe. You know, we're not capable of managing right now the full range of desires that are unleashed by sort of this moment. And so what we're doing is we're flipping between sort of utopian and apocalyptic. There's nothing wrong with utopian sort of aspirations, but it's really toxic to imagine that we're going to achieve utopia. And what it produces on the other side is a sort of apocalyptic end of the world scenarios.
Right.
And in general, human beings were never as powerful as our fantasies or triumphant as our fantasies, and it's never as bad as our nightmares. And so holding some sort of range on, you know, sort of the fantasy, nightmare, utopian, apocalyptic, dialectic or dance is a good thing to have.
Okay, so
I hope that wasn't too much.
no. I'm just thinking what I want to ask you next, because
good you taped
there's
it.
so many things that I could ask you. Okay, so how can taking a contemporary view of God and faith, either through Judaism, another defined religion, prayer, or even someone's, you know, undefined spirituality, how can that give us access to infinite happiness or utopia?
Right. So first of all, again, infinite happiness or utopia is an aspiration. The most dangerous thing to think is that you're going to have it. The second you think you have it, it disappears. It's sort of like, you know, being in the flow. And so I want to contain the desire for infinite happiness. It's an aspiration. Now, what we can learn from religion as we move to a post-religion society, and in the West we're moving very quickly to that. There, I think it's a combination of sort of archaeology and psychology, and that is we need to mine the stories, we need to mine the wisdom, we need to mine practices to see where they can help us become more conscious of our reality. And there, I'm sort of I don't get up in the morning worrying about the preservation. I know this is weird to say as a rabbi. I don't get up in the morning and worry about the preservation of Judaism. And I urge ministers and priests and other religious leaders who we work with in the variety of programs that we have, that the job is not to worry about the preservation of the institution or the creed or the dogma or the practice, or the people or the tribe. The issue is you get up in the morning and think about how can I help people flourish using the tools that if we're religious leaders or faith-rooted leaders, we have access to. And so there, I'm very interested in the jobs that religion historically got done. So if one of the jobs religion historically got done was to help expand the moral imagination by the use of parables and allegories and stories and practices, expanding the moral imagination seems like a pretty serious job that still needs to get done. Um, but it's not going to be prescriptive in our old-time religion way, because we're going to need as much innovation in the moral imagination as we have innovation in the in the sectors of innovation, and we're going to have to use the same sort of dynamic. So it's not that morality becomes this fixed thing, but morality also is evolving. And so there, when one looks, let's say, at scripture, and one looks through an evolutionary lens, and one looks through an innovation lens in which agility and resilience and being iterative is central to the innovator's experience, we look and we say, wow, let's look at this God character and see how this God character is evolving from a sort of angry, rageful in the story of Noah, he lashes out, to by the end there's a more ability to partner and collaborate. And what if we began to look and read some of these stories for those invitations for the expansion of our moral imagination? I mean, look, it's pretty clear we're becoming the gods we imagined, right? I mean, for most of the last, 10,000 years or whatever, there was an imagining, or surely the last 4,000 years, 3,000 years, there was an imagining that we were known completely, and being known completely, we were loved, and we projected that on the cosmos with a God who loves us and protects us and nurtures us and knows us fully, knows our secrets, knows our inside, knows our temptations, knows our thoughts, knows our hiddenness. And now it turns out, if you imagine that for enough time, eventually the technology, it's like the Jetsons, the technology catches up to the science fiction in one way or another. Now, this isn't science fiction. This is profound sort of human fiction. But, the gods you create, you become. So now the question is, either we make our gods bigger, or we have to act with immeasurable more responsibility. And that's what a sort of using the religious resources in playful and imaginative ways invites us to think about and reflect about. Mm-hmm. Because we actually have experience with surveillance, right? We have experience with having created a God who surveils us and knows everything about us. And looking at that's both been for the good and for bad. It's been manipulated by religious leaders who accessed that and pretended to know what God knew about us, and that was very dangerous. That's early Facebook, right? That's an early algorithm. So we can learn from that. Gosh, what did we do, right? What were the excesses when we projected that on a blank cosmos and there was a God who knew us perfectly? On the other hand, what was the power of that to feel forgiven when we really could use the awareness that we can be known completely and still be worthy, even if we're fuck-ups? Right? That there's a worthiness that we have by the very givenness of our life, independent of our status, independent of our net worth, and independent of what it is we actually accomplish for other people or for the world. Well, that's a really interesting thing to understand. It'd be great to teach teenagers, right, who we now know, teenage girls, especially on social media, teenage boys, and for their own way, right, what it would feel like to be known, but that doesn't turn into, reputation destruction or fear of missing out or having to posture all the time because the external face has to be so different from the internal face. The persona has to be so different. There's a lot to learn from sort of the theologies or the stories in which we were known by this God who loved us even if we did fuck up. Mm-hmm. That would be a play. That would be like the sorts of ways in which we can use. But even a practice like that all the Western religions have of a Sabbath practice, right? It's pretty clear that I'm not saying we need a 24-hour Sabbath. I mean, that maybe is a sort of Jewish take or a Christian take, but it's pretty clear that what the level of distraction that the external technology is now creating is literally beginning to affect the way in which we think. And so maybe we don't need to not work. Maybe Sabbath of not working in the field is not so important in a post-agricultural age, in which most people are living in the cities and don't have farms. But some sort of restraint, self-regulation regarding the use of technology that doesn't dump on the technology, that doesn't. It's just like we didn't demonize agriculture when we said once a week we shouldn't work, right? We don't have to demonize technology to say we control the technology. The technology doesn't control us. So what would I mean, I know that Tiffany Shlain just wrote a book, because I was one of the readers of the book. Tiffany Shlain wrote a book called, I forget the name, Sabbath Tech or something like that, 24/7 technology, something of Sabbath from technology. Well, I mean, that book, first of all, that book is selling off the rack, and it's been out for a month. So it's tapping into something. If someone would have told you, oh, you're going to see there's going to be a sort of resuscitation or resurrection of the Sabbath. Now, I don't know what that Sabbath will look like. I'm sure it won't look like anything like it looked